the same. So they are certified police officers, and Mr. Miller will get into that. So they are police officers, they have their arresting powers, they have the ability to carry a firearm on campus, but they also will serve the responsibility of security guards, because hopefully we won't have an emergency every minute of every day, and that this person can do other things to interact with students and pieces like that, right? So I'm going to try to call Mr. Miller in, see if he's available, ask him to just give an overview and answer any questions that you might have from a legal standpoint. Hi, Mr. Miller. It's David. How are you? Good. All right, I'm going to put you on speaker so that we can see how the board's going to go, all right? All right. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think we'll just ask you to use your outside voice, because I think sitting at the board table we're probably okay, but maybe the recordings as well as the people in the back. So we have you stretched as far as we can. So we appreciate you making this work tonight, Mr. Miller. If you would just give us an overview, I've talked briefly about school resource officer versus school police officer, but if you would just give us an overview of what that looks like, what the qualifications of the men and women would be, as well as their training requirements and the timing for this to work legally.
All right, so what we're talking about, obviously, is Act 44, signed into effect on June of 2018, and it divides the world into three things. One, at the lowest level, a school security guard. That's an individual employed by a school entity for routine safety and security duties. Under the statute, they can provide safety support services, campus supervision, some limited assistance with disrupted students, monitoring visitors on campus, coordination with law enforcement officials, and so on and so forth. They are not given the power to arrest, that is the school security guard. The next level up is your school police officer. That's a law officer employed by the school district whose responsibilities, including work hours, are set by the school district. That's the language of the statute. And the school entity may either employ or contract with school police officers. The school police officer, before you enter into the duties of office, you have to take an oath, standardized swear out, affirm, support, defend the Constitution, etc. They have to wear a shield. Their compensation has to be paid by the school district. An SPO, a school police officer, is not an SRO. The SRO is an employee of a separate entity. The school police officer is the employee of the district. The school entity has to apply to the judge of the Court of Common Pleas of the county in which you are located to appoint a person or persons as the school board may designate to act as SPOs for the school entity. Upon application, the judge would sign an order which grants the SPO the power to arrest, the authority to issue citations for summary offenses, the authority to detain students until the arrival of local law enforcement, or any combination thereof. And of course, if the district would hire an SPO, we would look for them to have all the powers permitted to them under the statute. An SPO has the power under the statute to enforce order in school buildings, if authorized by the court, to exercise the same powers exercised under law and ordinance of the police of the municipality, and to issue summary citations. In other words, they have most of the important powers of a school resource officer or a regular police officer by order of court, but they must have it by order of court, okay? SPOs who've been granted those powers have to have completed MOPEC training. That's the training, the Municipal Police Officer Education and Training Commission or the same kind of training that a municipal police officer has undergone, Act 120 training, or have graduated from the State Police Academy and been employed as a state trooper and separated from service in good standing. So those are school police officers. With respect to how long it would take to have a judge certify a school police officer, I suspect it's more than a day and probably less than 30 days. It requires a petition to common pleas court where we would have to go in and have a judge at motions court approve an SPO and sign an order. It's not particularly complicated, but anytime you're talking about courts, judges, and lawyers, it takes more than a day. The last category of individuals is the school resource officer, the SRO. That's a law enforcement officer who's commissioned and employed by a law enforcement agency, whose duty station is located in the school entity, and whose stationing is established by an agreement between the law enforcement agency and the school entity, right? And so the school entity may confer certain powers on an SRO to assist in developing school policy, to develop and educate students, to address crime and violence issues, and so on and so forth. And you may engage in intergovernmental cooperation agreements with entities to provide SROs in the school districts, and we've done a number of those circumstances. But what it comes down to is those are the three areas where you can by which you can provide security. Security guards cannot be given the power to arrest by order of the court, do not have the same level of training, even if they don't have the same level of training, unless they are an approved school police officer falling under the terms of the statute with court approval. That's the entity that has the power to detain and provide summary offenses and provide take certain police actions. And of course, SROs who are serving law enforcement officers co-located in the school have all the powers of any law enforcement officer. That's pretty much how the world breaks down.
Mr. Miller, what are the annual requirements in terms of training, if anything, for an SPO versus an SRO versus a Penridge Regional Police Officer?
If I heard you correctly, what's the annual requirements?
Yes. What type of training will this person or persons have to have annually?
They'll have to have the annual training required by MOPEC, which includes the updates that I think occur every 2 years, if I read the regulations appropriately, to have the continuing education that that's the same kind of continuing education municipal police officers undergo.
Okay, so their training requirements would be the same as an SRO's training requirement for a Penridge Regional Police Officer.
In order for them to be approved by a judge and authorized to carry a firearm and be an SPO, yes.
Okay, great. Do the board have any other questions clarifying?
Does that include the annual firearms certification, right? Is that in addition?
That also includes the annual firearm certification. I don't know if it's annual or not, but whatever the firearm certification is, that would be part of that as well?
Yes. Of course, if we're going to have anyone carry a firearm, they're going to be certified yearly.
Okay.
Any other questions from board members? Mr. Miller, what I'm going to suggest is that we not act on this at the February board meeting, but that we, again, just put it on the agenda as a discussion item for you to provide a brief synopsis just like you did, so that we give the community plenty of opportunity to hear this information and ask clarifying questions that they might have. I do know that there were conversations in this community about this issue last year, and the decision to put in a school resource officer was there. So I know many of those conversations happened, but I just want to go slowly. So I'll just ask you that for the February board meeting, if you be ready again to say similar things that you just said, and we'll all act like it's the first time we're hearing it.
So just one comment before I sign off. I think that's wise. I know that we have just connected with the Department of Education, and they are within the next couple of weeks coming out with some further guidance on Act 44, but we have talked to them extensively about the materials that we previously taught on, and it's my understanding that they see their view of what is required and permissible under Act 44 is very similar to what I just enunciated. So I'm happy to talk about that further, because I do believe that this is an area of the law that's fluid, and we want to make all the right choices and fully informed choices.
Okay. Any other clarifying questions for Mr. Miller before we?
I think that's entirely appropriate to have further discussion, because some of this in the spring, before Act 44 was enacted, or at least became operable, was done in public view,
Yes.
and some of it has been done in executive session because the act allowed that, right? So I think the community isn't particularly aware, maybe some are, but many aren't, of this, what this means and what the decision may bring.
Yeah, I think to have as many opportunities for public comment.
Plus the fact, I think, that your whole proposal tonight, obviously, is the first we've heard about the 2019-2020 budget, really, right? It's, in my opinion, sort of taken almost out of context in the sense that what else you're going to propose or not propose. And as you said, certainly there always is this decision about how many teachers we employ in the district based on decisions that students make and the number of students that enroll in any given year. So that has an effect on this too, but I do think that this is kind of the first step rather than the last step, so to speak. Right? So actually, I would like to see more of the budget before having to be being asked to make these decisions.
Okay. Anything else for Mr. Miller? Mike, thank you. We appreciate it.
Dr. Bolton, before I ring off, I just want to note for the record, I am still wearing a bow tie right this minute.
Is it green?
It happens to be green and pink. Thank you very much.
And you get 2 points. Well done.
Got that spring fever today.
See ya.
Bye.
He does have some sort of obsession. Okay. Same thing from a dollar standpoint as you look at the bottom, right? I did want to estimate out the cost in terms of 2 school police officers, with one of them being director of security, as well as the 5 hours of part-time security guard. And so the reason it says that costs $83,000, but then it says savings of $17,000, the current budget has $100,000 allocated for a school resource officer. So that's basing off of that money that's currently in the budget and not being spent. If we were to spend those dollars today, there would be a $17,000 savings to the budget. But it's not really a savings, but it is compared to this year's budget and the numbers that were there. It's not new money for next year is what I'm trying to say in terms of that piece. Okay? Mr. Rajan, and again, I'm sorry if I have your last name incorrectly. We've had lots of conversations about trainings, and I know that that was part of your public comment. Obviously, Mr. Miller talked a little bit about those types of things. There are at least 3 times a year school resource officer trainings that are provided for people who are doing these jobs for local police officers, and our SPO would be expected to go to at least one of those every year.
Right.
And that does provide some of the trainings that are unique to being in this setting. We would also look for what I would just, for the lack of a better term, some ed psychology trainings to make sure these people are aware of how do you handle a 17-year-old differently than maybe handling a 37-year-old at Brooklyn. You know, it is very different, like you said, and to make sure that they are reasonable but still within their roles, making sure they're maintaining order, as well as things like continuum of force. You know, that there are lots of things you do before you ramp up a situation. And all police officers go through those trainings. That's part of the MOPEC requirements that Mr. Miller referred to, as well as our security guards gaining some of those additional trainings as well. It's not appropriate for our security guards to go to an SRO training, but some of those ed psychology pieces, we've made the commitment and are talking about incorporating that for all of our security guards, so that when they're handling someone who's having a bad day, how do you handle that and not escalate it, but still handle it, right? It's basically parenting 101, but for a school security guard.
I mean, my brother's a police officer, just to like, most of the times they're coming to the end of the situation. And what I'd like to know is, what's the school doing prior to the situation? Like, you know, outreaches. When you see kids in a, not doing good? What are we doing to engage them to try to prevent something escalating to that level? I'm not saying don't get officers, I still think we need them, but there should be our last line versus outreach, getting kids engaged with other kids, getting them feel like part of the community, so they're not isolated, they're not doing other stuff. So that also should be a part of it.
So I appreciate that in terms of that piece.
I think it should be noted that all the security guards currently are former police officers, right?
I believe all but one. I think one of the new hires is not, if I remember that correctly, although I'm not positive. But you're right, the majority of our security guards, if not all of them, are
Presumably,
actually.
they've had some of this training in the past, not current, but in the past, right?
Correct. Okay. The last piece is just additional curriculum and teacher support areas. One is to look at our elective areas. Currently, we have elective area coordinators in areas like art and music and library, where they are full-time teachers, but they then provide support or are asked to provide curriculum and support. That is a very difficult task when you are teaching full-time. And almost all of them, all but one, are at the high school. And so if we have a new teacher at the elementary school, almost all of that support is done either electronically or after hours. What I've asked is that we consider where possible, because this may be possible or not depending on student choice, and we need to prioritize student classes, but where possible either utilizing their current teaching schedule or through the allotment of a 6th section where other people can choose to teach 6 classes. It's part of the collective bargaining agreement. That we look to provide where possible one additional period for those elective area coordinators. We would embed them where possible at the end of the day so that there would be time for them to leave the high school and go to the middle school or the elementary school to actually be in the classroom with these teachers and to provide that support. It's similar to what the curriculum supervisors are doing, but on a smaller scale because there aren't as many of those teachers in each department and they have full-time teaching responsibilities. And so that is what that piece is. That cost of $14,000 is budgeting for 6 sections. 6 sections is $3,500 in the new collective bargaining. And so we're anticipating that of the 6 coordinators I'm talking about, 4 of them, this might work. And that we have a 6th section, right? And so that's an estimate, but that's where I picked that in terms of that piece. Also just informing you that one of the pieces we're doing with Dr. Scheid's oversight is assigning administrative liaisons for each department. Currently, if you think about the principal at, name any school you want, right? So the principal at South. Dr. McAllister has an expertise, right? She has training, she has skill sets in terms of the back, and I actually don't know Dr. McAllister's, but let's say it's social studies. Well, for us to be able to assign her to help the social studies department on what I would call the district curriculum department days, because when you have K through 12 curriculum supervisors, they often have 3 different responsibilities going on in a staff development. They have something for the elementary school, something for the middle school, something for the high school students. And so Dr. Dormer is a perfect example. In those days, she'd have to be 3 different places at one time. And so she can bring them all to the same building and move around, right? And that's what they're currently doing. But to be able to then have other administrators who have at least a level of expertise in that, to be able to say, hey, can you be another set of eyes and ears and help me with the middle school who's working on curriculum? And here's what I want you to do, and I'll be over in an hour, right? But to keep them moving and to help support that process, to provide a little additional responsibility for current administrators within the area of curriculum. I think it also increases the buy-in from a curriculum standpoint when the building administrators are fully aware of what the teachers are doing and the curriculum departments are doing. They get that information right now, but in the busyness of the day, it might be sometimes hard to fully attend to that. And so if you're deeply involved, I do think that it will benefit from that standpoint. Now, these savings numbers are here, our current year budget. So these are not, this does not mean all of these proposals are $60,000 cheaper than if we didn't do them, okay? This is if you think about the money that was allocated this year for the 3 additional teachers and the SRO, and compare these recommendations with all of the changes, for the current year, if we were to do this instead of what was budgeted, it would be about $60,000 cheaper. All right, so that's what that number means. So when you look at additional recommendations, the additional recommendations would be new money. This is just money that's already in the budget. Now, that doesn't mean the board has to continue and keep that budget, but that is the dollar to dollar that I was comparing it off of the positions, which is why these recommendations were within the confines of what's currently happening as opposed to what could be happening next year. That is more wagged by the students. Many of these things are determinations and recommendations of current moving around the deck chairs and pieces like that. Are there any questions on any of that? So from a standpoint of the conversations that we've had in the posting of positions, obviously the director of communications and public relations, that position has been posted, right? We have a retirement, and so we are moving forward. From a standpoint of talking with Source for Teachers around the additional playground and lunchroom aides, those are pieces that can be accommodated in the current budget and our current job descriptions that we have, which means we are moving forward with the additional playground lunchroom aides for this year to see if we can get them in place as soon as possible. The other positions are things that we will continue to talk about and see what gets approved in terms of job descriptions in February to be able to move forward or not with those positions from that standpoint. We will have to have a conversation. Let's assume that from an SPO standpoint that we get to March and we are ready to have a recommendation at the March board meeting, because that gives us the February board meeting and then committee meetings in March to have additional conversation. If we feel ready at March, if you feel ready at March, and we're going to act on that recommendation, the question would be, do we want to move forward immediately, or do we wait? Right? Because there is going to be a time delay to not only find the people, but then also get them through the court system. And so whether we do that, the question would be, when do we post? Do we post in April and then say it's a July 1? Do we post in April and hire as soon as possible? Because the current budget will obviously allow for some expenditures there, because there is that line item there. Mr. Delbert is comfortable with that. And so that is part of the conversation, the decision we'll need to make, because it's not your normal teaching position that has that same rhythm, right? There are summer responsibilities and some. One thing that I didn't mention from the SPO standpoint that is in the job description, beyond what I would call the normal security guard, the security guards currently work 181 days, and which is the number of student days. So they work student days. We are asking the director of security to work an additional 15 days. And so they would be primarily at the end of the school year or staff development days or at the beginning of the school year for trainings. So they would be developing trainings for staff, for students. They would supervise the ALIS trainings for our new teachers. And so there would be some extra days that would be built into there, so that wouldn't be extra pay. Currently all of that's extra pay. If we have those people come in for any of those during the summer, we provide some supervision for the sports teams that come in. Not that we need to supervise them full time, but there is that type of thing. As well as then the other school police officer, we would expect 10 additional days. And so that is in the job description. You'll see that one says 196 days and one says 191 days. And that is the difference between those two positions. That is in addition to what they're currently be doing as a security guard from that standpoint.
So if we were to hire them in the spring, or try to hire them in the
Yes.
spring, then they would have most of the summer off, correct?
Correct. They would, yes. We'd have to decide what trainings we need to develop the first time through, but yes. Okay. All right. That's it from a standpoint of recommendations.
All right, so the discussion at this point will move to the actual job descriptions, I believe, which is what remains on this item. So the first one is for the school police officers and the director of security, who is one of those two, as the proposal. The question is, are there questions on this particular job description? I do have a question or a comment. In item 6 of the qualifications, there is a comment about understanding educational administrative rules, regulations, school board policies. I'm presuming these people won't come with that kind of knowledge likely. I would think that's something that we will need to train them to do, at least the school administrative rules and policies, regulations. Obviously, the school law, if they're police officers, I presume that's something they would come with the knowledge of.
Yes. And that is the purpose of putting that in there, obviously specific to the confidentiality, which is obviously a very key one in any position, as well as, like you said, the administrative regulations and how we handle. Because these would be people who would be involved in more severe cases of our policies, where the security guards would be only the initial part of that generally, and the administrators are handling all of that. And so to make sure that that person, where appropriate, is aware of those, yes, that you don't want us to train them.
Is it possible to use our PSBA it's a very comprehensive program, actually, if we could just put them.
Can you speak up a little bit, just,
I have a very
Thank
sore
you.
throat, but.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would have to reach out to PSBA to see what resources they have specific to
Sorry.
SPOs and SROs. That's a good
Okay.
idea, so
Yeah.
I'll have to look out and see.
Are there other comments or
I
questions?
just have one, but my voice is worse than Carol's, so we'll try.
That time of year.
Then under the qualifications, I don't see any specific reference to child abuse clearances. Means these officers have been working in close proximity to children. I don't know if that's something we should specifically add, or it's implied.
Is it, I would think
They
it's
have to
implied.
add them to.
It would be applied, the board wouldn't be in a position to hire someone for the district unless they did have the
So you're
required
saying
clearances.
it's, so it's,
It
you just
is.
said it's a requirement.
In addition to that, your police officers usually come with that anyway, they always have.
Just,
Yeah, but we would
Double checking.
vet them as we do any other employee, do those
Double
3
checking.
clearances and et cetera, before they were brought before you.
sorry, sir.
Any other comments or questions?
I think it would be.
So this, along with the rest of this proposal, will not be voted on in February, is that correct? Or you're asking us to do that despite the fact that we,
I would make the recommendation that the school police officer not be on the agenda for February.
that's
If
what I
we're comfortable
assumed.
with the other job descriptions, I would suggest that they do go for February, because then when we're ready to move forward, we can do that. But the school police officer, I think from a level of conversation, we ought to leave that on. And that would be my recommendation, that we just bring it
I
back
agree.
around.
Oh, Oh, um,
That makes sense.
that we-
Yeah, I think we do need to allow time for public.
Right.
On it, right?
Yep.
All right, so the other job description that is available tonight, proposed, is among this category as the curriculum supervisors. And there are 4 of those. And I believe they parallel one another.
Very close.
We do have a comment. I think in terms of the, and this is a personal bias, I'll admit that up front. In terms of the science supervisor, it seems to me that simply asking them to hold a certificate in elementary education, which is a general certificate, is actually not sufficient. I think, and it may be true for the other disciplines as well, but I think in science, it's, especially since there are very specific disciplines in science at the high school, chemistry, biology, physics, earth science, a number of things, and it's not a subject that our teachers are famous for having as part of their preparation when they go to a college and get an elementary certified. They may take a course in science, maybe even a course in science education, but I don't think that's sufficient, frankly. So to me, it needs to be somebody who has a science background.
So could I
Is it
just,
worded
part of the job description, which possibly I'll just add a few words in there. Number 1, the first qualification is hold a Pennsylvania supervisory or administrative certification. That would actually be a single area content supervisor in science or an administrative principal PK-12. So they would have to have either the supervisory in science, and it's called a single area content supervisory cert,